At 8 a.m. on June 8, 2015, 72-year-old James Lee Rogers parked his beautiful red Corvette in the parking lot of a Waffle House in Port Arthur, Texas. And as he pulled that car into the lot, James, he just felt so proud to be driving this vehicle. This was a 2007 C6 Chevy Corvette, pristine condition, and it was exactly the car that James had been dreaming about like his whole life. It drove amazing, it looked incredible, and more than that, it had all these modern elements to it. It didn't even have regular door handles. Everything was like push buttons and electric. To him, owning this car was like owning a really flashy sports car, and he thought that, anybody who saw him driving it, they knew this guy had made it. And on top of having this really cool car, James also had like a pretty awesome life here in Port Arthur. He had lots of family in the area. He had grown up here. He loved living here. But he also really loved this particular Waffle House. It was where he went basically every morning in his flashy car to get his coffee. But, it wasn't just their coffee that he was drawn to. It was the wait staff. It was the regulars who went to this Waffle House. This had become like a sort of second home for him, and he really looked forward to coming here basically every day. And so he parks his Corvette, he gets out, and before he walks into the restaurant, he has to tell his dog, he had brought his dog along, Leia, this cute little dog, to stay in the car because the dog was not allowed in the Waffle House. This was something he knew, but it was going to be quick. So he told Leia, to be a good girl and stay in the car. Don't rip it up. This is his dream car. She was a very good dog. And so she sat down. He shut the doors, used the electric push buttons to do it. And then once he knew his dog was secure, into the restaurant he went. Once he got inside, James took his usual seat at the counter where his friend MJ was already sitting. MJ was in his 60s, and like James, he was also a fixture at this Waffle House. And so the two immediately began chit-chatting about the weather and their kids. And then at some point, James ordered his coffee and used that as a chance to catch up with some of the wait staff that he spoke to every morning. And then eventually more regulars began filtering in and out, and James made a point to chat with them and laugh with them as well. Again, this was like his second home. And in fact, on this particular day, there were so many people that he wanted to talk to coming in and out of the restaurant that he decided, my dog's fine out there. I've only been in here for a few minutes. I'm going to order some food as well. However, right after James ordered his food, he turned and he looked out the window into the parking lot. And even though he couldn't actually see his Corvette, he could see that it was extremely sunny and very hot outside. Like he knew that when he showed up, but he's looking out there and it just looks like a desert out there. It's so hot and like there's nobody out there. It's just cars getting blasted by the sun. And he's thinking like Leia's out there. And even though he had the AC on when he pulled up, and so, likely his Corvette was still a little bit cool, there was no way that it was particularly comfortable in his car right now. And so before his food showed up, James turned to MJ and just said, "Hey, I'm going to be right back. You want to just like hold my seat? I'm going to go out and check on something." And MJ, who was kind of busy talking to other people, he's like, "Yeah, go ahead. I'll save your seat." And then James left the restaurant to go check on Leia. And so James, after leaving the Waffle House, he sort of ran around the corner out of view of where he had been sitting, and he went over to his beautiful dream car. And as soon as he walked up to the window, he could see that Leia was, very excited inside, happy to see James again. And, just for good measure, even though he now knew his dog's okay, he climbed inside the driver's seat and shut the door, and he turned around and he pet his dog, and he could tell the temperature inside the car was not that bad. And so he was only going to be in the restaurant for another 15, 20 minutes tops. She'd be okay. However, after only having sat inside his car for a matter of maybe like 30 or 60 seconds, he felt himself getting really hot. It was definitely not cool inside the car, and the sun's burning through the windows. And he just was like, you know what? This is not responsible to leave my dog in here. I can't do this. And so even though he had placed his order for food, he figured he could go in there, cancel the order. He was a regular. They'd understand. He could have one more sip of coffee, but that was it. He needed to get back out here and basically put the AC back on and get him and his dog back into the comforts of their own home. But when James pushed that super fancy button on his car door that he was sort of so proud of how modern his vehicle was, when he pushed it to open his door, nothing happened. And so James, he's just staring at the door in confusion because this has never happened before. And so he starts pushing it a few more times. But again, nothing happened. And then after a few moments, when this car door was not budging, James reached across and started pushing the button on the passenger side door to see if maybe it was just an issue with, his door. But no, that door wouldn't open either. And so finally, he decided he would just try to turn the car on to see if maybe that would help. But he couldn't get his car to turn on. The Corvette was completely dead, and James had no idea why. But he knew this was not good because, this car, because it's so modern, didn't have normal handles. They really were all electric, all buttons. And so if these buttons aren't working and all the windows are up, what do you do? How do you get out? And so James, he's starting to stress out about what's going to happen here? Is he going to have to break a window of his beloved vehicle here? Is that what he's going to have to do? And also, how crazy is that? How could he have wound up in this position? But also, the sun is just burning through the glass and he's suddenly becoming really aware of just how hot it was getting inside of his car. This is sort of becoming an emergency really quickly. Because again, he can't even turn on the car, so he can't turn on the AC. He's inside of an oven at this point. And so James instinctively reached for where his phone would normally be, but it wasn't there. And that's when he remembered he had left his phone inside the Waffle House. When he had gone in earlier, it was low on charge and he had handed it off to one of the waitstaff to go plug in somewhere. And so his phone's inside. He has no way to contact anyone. But luckily, right at that point, James looked out the corner of his eye and he saw a couple walking out of the Waffle House. And he's like, oh, thank goodness, someone's coming out. I can get their attention. They can come over here and get me out of here, or at least, call someone who can. And so he starts waving, through the front windshield at this couple as they're sort of walking generally in his direction, but they clearly didn't see him. The sun is glaring off the glass, kind of making it hard to see inside. And so James is sort of realizing this, and he's becoming more and more desperate as he and his dog are getting more and more overheated. And so he began leaning on the horn to get their attention that way, but no sound came out of his Corvette because the horn was powered by electricity, and again, the car is dead. And so James now is getting frantic. He's banging on the windows, he's screaming to them. But this is a nice car. It's totally soundproof inside. Again, there's the glare from the sun on the glass. The windows are partially tinted. They can't see or hear him. And so this couple eventually comes right near his vehicle. They climb in their car and they drive away without ever noticing him. Once they were gone, James told himself that, this is a busy area. Lots of people come in and out of this Waffle House. Someone's going to see us. Someone's going to get us out of this car. And so for the next several minutes, James looked all around him, looking for anybody walking through this parking lot, looking for people coming out of the Waffle House, and anybody who came even close to his vehicle, he would scream and yell and bang and do anything he could to get their attention. But nobody noticed him. No one could see or hear him. And now James and his dog were really starting to struggle with the heat inside of this vehicle. It really was like they were trapped inside of an oven. And so eventually, when it seemed like no one was going to notice them, James just began frantically looking around the interior of his car for a toolkit. He thought he had left a toolkit in here somewhere, in case of emergencies. And he's thinking, maybe there was a tool in there he could use to maybe jimmy open one of the doors, or if he had to, he could maybe use something heavy in the toolkit to break a window, just to get out that way. And so eventually, in the back seat near Leia, he found this toolkit, but when he cracked it open, he was disappointed because it really didn't have anything that useful. There were some pliers, there were some jumper cables, and a flashlight. But, James, he still took the pliers and he jammed the head of the pliers into the crack of the driver's side door to attempt to basically wrench open the door. But the pliers were very thin, and so he didn't budge the door at all. And he used a lot of energy trying to, force the door open. And remember, it's blisteringly hot inside of the vehicle at this point, and it's getting harder and harder to breathe. Leah's struggling to breathe. James is, drenched in sweat, and so he drops the pliers, and he just has this huge wave of anxiety come over him that oh my goodness, is this it? Are we going to die in here? And so as this crushing reality is coming down on him, James has this adrenaline surge, and he leans back in his seat and he starts kicking as hard as he can against the glass with his feet to try to break open the windshield or kick open the driver's side window. But amazingly, despite all of his energy going into this, he didn't crack the window at all. Like it felt like he was kicking a concrete wall. There was no budge, nothing. And so again, after exerting even more energy and now sweating even more, and it's getting harder and harder to breathe, James took those pliers and he's really gassed, he can barely breathe, and he starts smashing the head of the pliers into the window. That didn't do anything. So it's like, I can't do anything to get out of this vehicle. And so James, he sort of just like lays back in the driver's seat, which he had reclined at this point, and he's panting, he can barely breathe, he's opened up his shirt a little bit, and he's looking back at his dog, and she's really struggling, and he's just like, I can't believe this is happening. And as he's laying there, he sort of looks towards the front of the car, and his eyes land on the glove box in front of the passenger seat. And it was like, oh my goodness, how could I forget? There's a manual inside of there. There has got to be instructions for what to do if your car dies. There's got to be a way to get out. Like, it's got to be in that manual. And so suddenly, having all this energy, James sat up, he opened up the glove box, and he pulled out this manual that he had never read before. I mean, he had no reason to, but he opened it up and he began looking through it, looking for, the section that would explain what to do in case of, total power outage and you're stuck inside the vehicle. But like as he's looking at the pages, like his vision's swimming, it's so hot, he's so tired, and it's all this little text, it's hundreds and hundreds of pages, and like nothing explained the situation. It was like so not user-friendly. And so James, he's flipping through all these pages, and even just the act of turning the page was becoming so laborious, like he is just beginning to shut down. I mean, he's basically dying inside of an oven, and he can barely turn the page, and then before long, after about a quarter of the way through, it's like he couldn't see anymore, and he literally he couldn't turn the page anymore. He had no strength left. MJ, so James's buddy, the guy in his 60s who was also a regular at the Waffle House, he's inside the Waffle House, he's having his breakfast and his coffee. He knew James had stepped out, he was going to be right back, and he did not come right back, but he figured no big deal, he probably got caught up with something. Maybe he forgot that he had ordered food. But, MJ, he's got all these reasons for why James has not come back to the restaurant. And also, MJ, being a regular, he's chatting it up with other people. He's not really even aware of the fact that James has not come back inside the Waffle House. And eventually, after MJ had had his coffee and his food, he's getting ready to maybe make an exit himself, when two employees come running in the front door of the Waffle House. And so everybody turns to these employees who clearly are sort of making a scene here, and they're like, what's going on? And the employees, they're like, we just saw James. He's asleep in his car and we can't open the doors. We slammed on the windows, but he's not reacting. At this point, MJ felt sick to his stomach because he suddenly realized when he looked at his watch, it had been 4 hours since James had gone outside saying he'd be right back. Now, MJ, he got caught up doing other things, and he was in here all the time. He loved being here. Time flew when he was in here, but even he didn't understand how much time had passed. And he's thinking oh my gosh, what's happened to James? And so MJ jumps out of his seat and he runs outside into the blistering heat. He goes around the corner to the red Corvette. He sees, through the tinted glass, there's James inside of the vehicle. He starts hitting on the window, but there's no answer. James isn't moving, and so MJ calls 911. It would turn out when James bought the red Corvette, it really was like his dream car. He fell in love with it. It was beautiful. It was flashy. It oozed status. It had all this new tech. It looked so expensive. It was perfect. And James, he didn't just, buy this car and that was it. After he had it, he obsessed over it. He learned every little detail about it. He took great care of it. He drove it everywhere. This was like his child. But despite, really obsessing over the car, he never learned one really important thing about this car, which is what do you do if you happen to be inside of the vehicle with the windows rolled up and your power goes out? Because the doors are not regular doors. They're powered by buttons. They're electrical. And if you have no power, you can't open them, as he found. Well, it turns out there's actually a lever under the driver's seat that once you pull it up, it pops open the driver's side door and you can get out, no matter if there's electricity or not. But that information was buried on page 80 of that owner's manual that he had pulled out and begun flipping through, but he was so delirious from heat exhaustion, he couldn't get that far into the manual. He's like combing through all this really dense text. He made it about a quarter of the way through, when unfortunately he and his dog Leia died from heat exhaustion. James's family filed a wrongful death case with Chevrolet, the maker of the Corvette, in 2018, but the case was dismissed. Chevrolet still makes Corvettes with these special electric doors, and there have been numerous additional incidents of people getting locked in and trapped. But in more recent Corvette models, the manuals have the information about the door's release lever much closer to the front of the manual. Our second and final story today is called A Call to Arms. On the morning of August 20th, 1862, a 17-year-old farmhand named Jean Leroux carried his axe over to a stack of logs by a barn on a farm in Ottawa Township, Minnesota. As a farmhand, Jean was responsible for lots of different odd jobs, like splitting the firewood and feeding the animals and helping with the crops. Basically, Jean had to know every single inch of the farm and the woods that surrounded it, and how to take care of it all. But even though he was basically constantly busy, Jean still found his mind wandering to a place that was sort of difficult, which was he felt a lot of times pretty homesick. So Jean was actually from France, and he had left behind his whole family and his, previous life to come here to America, where there was supposed to be more opportunity. However, America was turning out to be a pretty violent place. The country was currently fighting the Civil War. And on top of that, the area specifically where Jean lived was pretty much like the frontier. And so there were these constant territorial disputes and virtually no law enforcement. So just a really dangerous place. But more than any dangers he faced, Jean just really missed his family, especially his mom. So he spent basically every spare minute he had, which was, few and far between, sitting out in the woods by this one particular just huge, beautiful oak tree. And he would sit at the base of it and he would make journal entries about basically everything he was doing so he could track it all and know what to tell his mom when he finally got to see her again. He just wanted to tell her all about his experience. Also, just for context, Jean had saved virtually all the money he had worked so hard to acquire. And his whole plan was to eventually send that money to his mother, who he loved so very much and missed so much. But more and more, like the more homesick he became, the more he wished he could actually just go back to France and get out of America and literally hand the money to his mom and just see her again and be done with this whole America experiment. But for now, Jean raised his axe over his head and he brought it down on the log that he was going to split. And it did, it split open, and he raised the axe again to chop another log, but as he did, he froze, because off in the distance, he could hear a series of repetitive booming noises, like really loud. And for Jean, immediately his heart started to race and he was so scared because he knew what those were. Those were gunshots. And he was terrified that the thing that he, and really everybody else in his town, had been scared of for days was now finally happening. So right on the other side of the woods that surrounded the farm was the Minnesota River. And over the last decade, lots of people had settled along this river. And there'd been a town established right nearby, and new homes were being built constantly. However, all the expansion had literally forced out the indigenous tribe who had previously lived in the area, the Sioux. And after being displaced, the Sioux had struggled to find food and a place to live, while the settlers just continued to expand and take more of their land. So finally, just 2 days earlier, the Sioux had had enough, and they finally retaliated, attacking settlements along that river. It was being called the Sioux Uprising, and the attacks so far had been horrific. A lot of farms along that river had been burned to the ground, and their occupants had been killed right alongside it. And then just yesterday, the Sioux had attacked a city that was just 50 miles down the river from where Jean was right now. And so Jean and everybody else in this particular area had really been terrified the last 24 hours that the violence was moving in their direction towards Ottawa Township. And so now Jean, he had put his axe down and he just stood there, trembling as the sound of gunshots continued. I mean, this was not just a few stray bullets. This was a barrage of gunfire. And so this could only mean one thing. The Sioux were here. Now, Jean couldn't tell exactly where the shooting was coming from, but he could tell it was pretty close. And so Jean knew that he likely only had maybe several minutes to gather up whatever he could of his possessions and get to safety before the Sioux arrived. So Jean, he bolts over to the farmhouse, goes inside, and he goes to the area inside where he slept, and he grabbed his rifle, and he also grabbed his notebook and all that cash he'd been saving for his mom. And he jammed the notebook and the cash into a satchel, and with his rifle over his shoulder, he ran back outside. And then once he was outside, he sprinted right towards the tree line at the edge of the property. And after running for a little while, Jean finally stopped to catch his breath and to listen to see if there was more gunfire. And as he sat there listening, he couldn't hear anything. But that's when he realized, he's all alone out here. If the Sioux came charging through the trees right now, he wouldn't stand a chance even with his rifle. But Jean had an advantage. He knew these woods like the back of his hand. He was in here all the time. And because of that, he knew exactly where to go to find safety. About an hour later, Jean's boss and the owner of the farm, Edward Gleek, hustled from his farmhouse towards town. Mr. Gleek had also heard the gunshots. Basically everybody in town had. And he had come running out of the barn just in time to see his farmhand, Jean Leroux, bolting off into the woods. And, Mr. Gleek, he didn't blame the kid. He was also horrified by the recent attacks and was also very worried that those shots they were hearing were a sign that trouble had finally arrived in their town. But after all these gunshots, no Sioux warriors showed up in town. And so now Mr. Gleek was heading to the town center to see what had actually happened. What were those gunshots? Now, Mr. Gleek had sort of accepted that this could have been something totally benign, or it could have been the Sioux. He didn't know. But he was just going to find out. He was rational, he was calm, despite, the risks here. But when he got into the town center, all he could see was just chaos. Many of the area's residents were out running around, carrying trunks and bags and all their belongings like they were fleeing the area, much like Mr. Gleek's farmhand, Jean Leroux, had looked like he was doing. However, it didn't take long for Mr. Gleek to hear what had happened, and it was not an attack by the Sioux. Those people running around like maniacs, fleeing the area, they just hadn't heard the real story yet. They were sort of operating like there was an attack coming. So apparently, a group of American soldiers had been riding on a boat up the Minnesota River, and for some reason, they just gotten overly excited and began firing their guns repeatedly. So those were gunshots. And unfortunately, because they were gunshots, they completely freaked out all the residents around the river because of this growing threat of the Sioux attacking. But fortunately, at least in this case, there were no attacks. This was just, an unfortunate event. And so after hearing this, Mr. Gleek went back to his farm to find Jean and tell him that, everything was actually just fine. But when he got there, Jean still had not come back yet. And when Mr. Gleek went into the woods to go look around for him, he couldn't find him. Now, Mr. Gleek figured that Jean would eventually find out what happened, much like everybody else in town. Not everyone had the news yet, and so at some point that day, he was bound to return. But by the time night fell, Jean still had not come back. And then the next day, Jean didn't come back. And the next day, and the next day, he just didn't come back. And so finally, after repeatedly searching his property and asking all over town if anybody had seen Jean, Mr. Gleek finally came to the conclusion that Jean must have fled because of this Sioux attack, and then likely gone back to France to be with his mother, something he knew he wanted to do anyways. Maybe this was his excuse. 57 years later, on a morning in July of 1919, Mr. Gleek sat on his porch looking out over his farm, the same farm that Jean had been a farmhand for 57 years earlier. Mr. Gleek was old now, and so he could no longer actually physically work on the farm himself. So instead, he had to hire entire crews to do various jobs. And in fact, right now, he had a whole bunch of workers out in the woods clearing away some dead brush for him. And so as Mr. Gleek is just kind of surveying his property, he notices a worker come running out of the tree line and starts waving at Mr. Gleek really frantically, like he had something really important to say. And then as the man got closer, Mr. Gleek could see that this worker looked terrified. And before Mr. Gleek could ask what had happened, the worker, whose face was, white as a ghost, said Mr. Gleek needed to come and see something. And so Mr. Gleek, who was, very intrigued at this point, managed to haul himself up, and he slowly hobbled off into the woods with this worker. And as he got to where the rest of the crew was, inside the forest, he saw that they were all mostly gathered around this very large, recently downed oak tree. And the whole group was very quiet and tense, and they were all just staring at a section of this tree that had split open. When Mr. Gleek joined the group and looked at this particular section of the trunk of this tree, this hollow part, at first he didn't even know what he was staring at. It was just this hollowed out sort of split section of the tree, and there was a few items that didn't belong there that were inside of it, like a cache of sorts. But then he sort of fixated on one particular item, and that's when he understood why the group was just so stunned. And as he stared and sort of took in what he was seeing, he suddenly became utterly horrified. It would turn out, when Jean ran off into the woods 57 years earlier, he used his intimate knowledge of the farmland and the surrounding woods to escape what he thought was a very dangerous situation. And he did that by hiding. Jean knew that oak tree where he would always go when he would write in his notebook happened to have a hollow trunk. And he figured he'd be just the right size to crawl inside of there and stay in there hidden until the Sioux were gone. And so Jean had made it to the tree, and he had wedged himself inside of there, totally out of view. And then unfortunately, he got stuck. From inside the trunk of the tree, Jean had managed to write one last letter to Mr. Gleek, saying that he couldn't get out, he was stuck. And if he did die here, to please give all his money to his mother in France. And so decades later, when Mr. Gleek's workers cut that big oak tree down, what they found inside of the hollow trunk was Jean's gun, his money, his notebook, and his mummified body.
58-year-old Charmin Stock woke up early on Easter Sunday, April 16, 2006. She was sure she heard the sound of raindrops on the roof of her two-story white farmhouse. She sat up in bed, already worried that her Easter egg hunt that she had planned for her 4 grandchildren that afternoon would be rained out. But just a second later, her husband of 48 years, Wayne Stock, reached over and gave her a gentle, reassuring pat on her back. Wayne knew how much his wife loved Easter. "Don't worry," he told her, "it's not rain, it's just the wind. I checked the weather last night, and it's going to be a beautiful day." At around 6:30 in the morning, the couple got out of bed, and Charmin headed downstairs to the kitchen to make sure that each of the Easter baskets she had put together for her grandchildren were perfect. Then she opened the refrigerator and started prepping food for the big family dinner she was going to make later that day. And as she did this, she looked out the window, and just like her husband had predicted, the sun was already starting to poke through the clouds. Just an hour later, dressed in their best clothes, these Stocks were sitting inside Ebenezer United Methodist Church, saying hello to their neighbors and friends, catching up on local news, and just really enjoying one of their favorite holidays. The Stocks lived in a tiny town in eastern Nebraska called Murdoch. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other and no one was worried about leaving their doors unlocked. In this tight-knit village of 270 people, Wayne and Charmin were especially well-liked and respected. They were active in the church, mentoring teens and teaching Sunday school. They also served on the school board, and Wayne had served in the Nebraska National Guard. Charmin had spent 17 years as a teacher's aide in the local elementary school, and now she operated a small business out of her house making specialty wedding cakes. In addition to the 1,000 acres of land Charmin and Wayne owned and farmed, the Stocks also had a successful business growing and selling hay. At 9:40 a.m., the organ music started and the congregation quieted down. As the couple waited in silence for the greeting from their pastor, Wayne and Charmin bowed their heads and gave thanks for all their blessings. On their way out of the church that morning after the service, Pastor Joe Wacker asked the Stocks what they were up to for the rest of the day to celebrate the holiday. As Charmin told him excitedly about her Easter egg hunt that she had planned for her grandkids, Pastor Joe smiled. people like Sharman and Wayne were the glue that held their families and communities together. And in a few hours, under a partly sunny sky, Wayne and Sharman were out in the backyard of their home, chatting with their married children and in-laws, and watching their 4 grandkids look along the edge of the barn for the brightly colored eggs that Sharman had hidden as soon as she had gotten home from church. Andrew Stock, the son who would one day take over the family hay business, was spending Easter with his fiance's family. But he had told his parents that he would be by their place that evening to pick up his dog. Andrew had just gotten a new puppy, and that morning he had dropped it off with his parents so that they could look after it for the day. So at around 8 p.m. that night, just as the Stocks had put away the last dinner dishes and picked up the house, they heard the sound of Andrew's truck in their driveway. It had turned into such a beautiful and clear and mild evening that the 3 of them decided to just stay outside on the back deck and chat for a bit. Sharman told Andrew all about the Easter egg hunt and how much the grandkids loved it. Then Andrew and his dad spent a few minutes chatting about hay prices and what needed to be done around the farm. Andrew told his father that he'd be back over the next morning to work in their hay office, and then Andrew picked up his tired puppy that had fallen asleep in the kitchen. He got back into his truck, he waved to his parents, and then he headed back down their driveway to the main road. As he looked in his rearview mirror, he saw his mom and dad turn towards their front door, take each other's hands, and step back inside of their house. The next morning, Andrew got up early, he grabbed a cup of coffee, and he headed outside to his truck. He drove the roughly 30 minutes to his parents' house, pulling into the parking area just outside of the office building for their hay operations, which was a small standalone structure set a ways back from the farmhouse. His mom and dad were both early risers, and his dad liked to get started on his chores right after breakfast. So as Andrew walked toward the hay office, he thought it was odd when he glanced over in the direction of the farmhouse and saw his father's truck still parked outside where he had left it the night before. So before going into the office to start his day, Andrew decided to go check the garage that was near the hay office and see if maybe his dad had just decided that morning to drive his wife's car instead of his own truck. But when Andrew went inside the garage, his mom's car was still there. Andrew suddenly felt like maybe something was wrong. The quickest way to get in touch with his parents from where he was just to call them on the office phone rather than walk or drive all the way across the property to the farmhouse. So quickly, Andrew left the garage and went into the hay office building and picked up the phone to dial their number. However, when he put the phone to his ear, his sense of worry rapidly turned into alarm because there was no dial tone coming out of the phone. It was disconnected. And Andrew could not think of a single reason why his parents would have disconnected their landline. It made no sense. So Andrew, now panicking, rushed out of the office, hopped in his truck, and sped across the big property to his parents' farmhouse. At 2 minutes before 9 a.m., Andrew knocked loudly on his parents' side door. When he didn't hear anything, he turned the knob and discovered that the door was unlocked. He stepped inside and immediately called out to his parents, but the house was quiet. And the kitchen, where he could always find his mom and a fresh pot of coffee, was empty. Andrew began to pray out loud that his parents would be okay as he walked from the kitchen toward the stairs that would lead to the second floor. As he walked up the stairs, he did what he'd done since he was a child. Without thinking, he dragged his right hand along the wall. And as he did, he felt something a little bit rough under his fingertips. When he turned to see what it was, he saw dark red smears and little red spots all over the wallpaper. And when he got to the top of the stairs and could see into the second floor hallway and master bedroom just beyond, Andrew saw something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Andrew turned around and ran back down the stairs out to his pickup truck, where he frantically grabbed his cell phone and dialed 911. 12 minutes later, the ambulance arrived. The medics pushed past Andrew and they went into his parents' house and headed up the stairs. When they reached the top, where Andrew had been standing 15 minutes earlier, they found Andrew's father, Wayne, lying in a pool of congealed blood. Just beyond Wayne, through the open master bedroom door, the medics could see another body. It was Wayne's wife and Andrew's mother, Sharman. She was lying on her back on the floor next to the bed. Her legs were outstretched towards the door, and a telephone receiver was still in her hand, like she had been trying to place a call when she died. Although the medics sprang into action looking for any signs of life on either of them, they knew their attempts were futile. It was immediately clear to them, as it had been to Andrew, that Wayne and Sharman were both dead. By the time police arrived, just 8 minutes after the ambulance had pulled up to the house, Andrew was on the phone with his brother and sister, telling them that something horrible had happened to their parents, and they needed to get out to the farmhouse as fast as they could. His sister Tammy remembered thinking at the time that whatever had happened, her brother must be exaggerating. The sleepy little town of Murdoch, where they lived, had to be one of the safest places in the world, and Tammy knew her parents were in good health. She had just spent the day before, Easter Sunday, laughing and talking with them, so they had to be just fine. But as she left work and climbed into her car, Tammy found herself repeating a prayer over and over again. The good Lord protects us. The good Lord protects us. But only a few minutes later, she would arrive at the farmhouse and would learn that both of her parents had been murdered. Tammy and her 2 siblings, Andrew and Steve, weren't the only people who were shocked and horrified by what had happened to Wayne and Sharman Stock. Local police had never seen anything like the grisly crime scene they discovered inside the farmhouse, and as word spread throughout Murdoch, the Stock's neighbors and friends also reacted with total disbelief. The investigation into the murders was immediately assigned to the local sheriff's office, but the sheriff knew he did not have the manpower or the experience to deal with this kind of a crime. So before he even left the crime scene that day, he called the state police and the nearest Nebraska Crime Scene Investigation Unit and asked them for help. Both organizations agreed and promised to have some of their people in Murdoch within the hour. The commander of the Crime Scene Investigation Unit was a man named David Caffode, a criminal profiler and legendary crime scene investigator who had a reputation for finding forensic evidence that everyone else had overlooked. While investigators from the sheriff's office started to conduct interviews with friends and family of Wayne and Sharman, David walked into the Stocks farmhouse for the first time. After examining the crime scene and looking at the few pieces of evidence police had collected, which included a few firearm shell casings, a red and silver marijuana pipe, and a small LED flashlight, David Caffode quickly reached 2 conclusions. The first was that the attack must have been personal, that the attackers knew the Stocks. He based this largely on the fact that violent crime was so rare in Murdoch. Also, the farmhouse did not appear to have been ransacked, which made it highly unlikely that it was a robbery gone wrong. The second conclusion David came to was that there likely had been 2 killers. He based this on a host of factors, including the positioning of the bodies and the blood spatter on the walls. On his way off the property, David told the state and local police that he believed this was a revenge killing carried out by 2 young men. He told the investigators that they should be looking for men who had a grudge against Wayne or Sharman or both, or who were at or near the Stock property in the last 24 hours. Since Andrew Stock had been the last person to see his parents alive, police quickly brought him in for questioning. But after only a few hours, they could tell he was not involved. There was absolutely no history of any trouble between him and his parents, and there was no financial motive since Andrew was already in line to inherit the family hay business. But police could not say the same thing for another member of the Stock family, Andrew's cousin, 28-year-old Matt Livers, who was the son of Wayne Stock's brother. Several relatives had told investigators that Matt had a history of conflict with Wayne and Sharman, who were his uncle and aunt, including a disagreement over who would inherit a house that belonged to Wayne and Sharman. So at about 11 p.m. on April 17th, 14 hours after the gruesome discovery at the Stocks farmhouse, a state police investigator and a sheriff county investigator brought Matt into the local police station for questioning. Although Matt admitted to arguing with his aunt and uncle, he denied any involvement in their murders. 4 hours later, when the police had not been able to find anything that connected Matt to the crime, he was allowed to return to the house he shared with his girlfriend in nearby Lincoln, Nebraska. In the meantime, other investigators had gotten a description of a light tan sedan car that a paper carrier had seen early on the morning of the 17th, parked near a fence between the Stocks property and an adjacent cemetery. The paper carrier also told police that this same car had passed him going very fast in the general vicinity of the Stocks home the night before. State and local investigators soon found a car that matched that description, It was a 1998 Ford Contour that belonged to a man named William Sampson, whose 21-year-old brother, Nicholas Sampson, happened to be the cousin of Matt Livers. On April 20th, 3 days after the killings, the Crime Scene Investigation Unit conducted a thorough examination of the Ford Contour. Although they did not find any physical or forensic evidence that linked the car to the Stock murders, they did discover that the car had recently been thoroughly cleaned and wiped down. So even without hard evidence, the fact that officers could draw a connection between a potentially suspicious vehicle and Matt Livers, and that Matt was the only suspect police could identify who had a personal motive for hurting Wayne and Sharman, investigators tightened their focus on Matt. They kept him under surveillance, they examined the trash he removed from his home, and they questioned his friends and his coworkers. Then, on the morning of Tuesday, April 25th, which was 8 days after the Stocks had been killed, investigators brought Matt Livers into the station where they gave him a lie detector test. After the test, they brought him into a room for another round of interrogation. Despite Matt repeatedly saying he had nothing to do with the murders, no one believed him. And at the conclusion of this 11-hour straight interrogation session, police would tell Matt that he failed his lie detector test. Shortly after hearing this, Matt Livers confessed that he and his cousin, Nicholas, had in fact killed Wayne and Sharman Stock. The Stock children were devastated all over again. Not only had they lost their parents, but now members of their own family had admitted to committing the murders. They did not want to believe it, and aside from Matt's confession, there still was no hard evidence actually linking Matt or Nicholas to the killings, and so some of the Stock family actually held out hope that maybe there had been a mistake. But that would change on May 8th, 3 weeks after Wayne and Sharman were found. Known for his thoroughness, the legendary crime scene investigator David Caffode ordered a second examination of the inside of the Ford Contour. And this time, he conducted the search himself. After going over the car interior 1 inch at a time, David discovered a single speck of blood underneath the dashboard. DNA testing showed that the blood belonged to Wayne Stock. This was the official nail in the coffin for Matt and his cousin Nicholas. They were both promptly charged with murder and sent to jail to await trial. While the residents of Murdoch breathed a sigh of relief knowing the killers were now behind bars, the police announced publicly that the bloody crime that had sent fear and shockwaves through the town and that had made headlines in the national press had been solved and the case was closed. Or rather, it would have been closed if it hadn't been for a single question raised by a young investigator named Christine Gabig, who worked in the sheriff's crime lab that had analyzed the evidence collected at the scene of the Stock murders. 2 days after the discovery of the marijuana pipe and LED flashlight that police had found outside of the Stock's house on April 17th, just hours after Andrew had discovered his parents' bodies, police, who were doing a final sweep of the crime scene, found a man's gold ring on the floor out of sight in the Stock's kitchen. The ring did not belong to either Wayne or Sharman, but the team investigating the murders did not think the ring could be connected to their case. They decided it was more likely that the ring had just been dropped in the kitchen sometime in the past by any number of visitors or family members, and no one had found it until now. But to Christine, the ring was a loose end that needed to be tied up. She knew Sharman ran her cake business out of her kitchen, and after asking around, it turned out Sharman had a reputation for being a perfectionist who kept her kitchen immaculately clean at all times. And so Christine's thinking to herself, how is it possible that Sharman is in this kitchen all the time, constantly cleaning it up and constantly making sure it's perfect? How does she not find this ring when we found it within a couple of hours of being in her house? It just didn't make any sense. Christine decided she would try to track down the owner of the ring to see how it wound up in the Stock household. When she looked at the ring, she saw there was a jeweler's mark on it, as well as an inscription that said, "Love always, Corey and Ryan." The inscription was distinctive because it was on the outside of the ring rather than the inside of the gold band. It took a while, but finally, in mid-May of that year, Christine was able to trace the jeweler's mark to A&A Jewelers in Buffalo, New York. Christine picked up the phone and she called the number for the store, and it would turn out, had she waited even a few hours longer to make that call, she likely never would have figured out who this ring belonged to. Because the day Christine called that jewelry store was literally the day they were going out of business. Mary Martino, who was an employee at this jewelry store, was about to disconnect the phone line when the phone rang. She picked it up, and without even waiting for an answer, she told the caller, who was Christine, that they were shutting down the store for good and, best of luck to you, and she was about to hang up. But Christine butted in and said, "Please, I'm a police officer and I need your help finding the owner of a ring that you sold. It's involved in a homicide case." Mary was very surprised to hear this, and also pretty excited. The idea of assisting in a murder case was kind of thrilling. So Mary spent the next 3 days and 2 nights in the jewelry store's warehouse tracking down the order for that gold band. 4 days later, Mary called Christine back and told her that the ring had been shipped to a Walmart in Beaver Dam, Wisconsin. 70 phone calls to Wisconsin later, and Christine had found the ring's owner, a man named Ryan who lived 2 full states away from Murdock, Nebraska. The ring had been a gift from his ex-girlfriend, Corey. Christine could just about see Ryan shaking his head on the other end of the line. He said, "I have no idea how my ring got to Nebraska." It turned out that Ryan's ring had been inside the glove compartment of his red Dodge Ram pickup truck, and that truck had been stolen in Wisconsin on April 15th, 500 miles away from Murdock, Nebraska, and 2 days before the murders of Wayne and Sharman Stock. And then Ryan's truck had been found abandoned a few days later on April 18th in Louisiana, 3 states away from Murdock, Nebraska. And the people who police believed had stolen Ryan's truck, 17-year-old Jessica Reed and 19-year-old Greg Fester, were already in police custody in Wisconsin. On June 6th, roughly 2 weeks after Christine made this discovery about the ring, the same 2 investigators who had gotten Matt Livers to confess to the murders of Wayne and Sharman Stock arrived in Dodge County, Wisconsin, and conducted separate interviews with Jessica and her boyfriend Greg, who'd been accused of not only stealing Ryan's pickup truck, but also going on a 4-day crime spree over that Easter weekend that took them from Wisconsin to Louisiana. And needless to say, investigators were shocked at what the teenaged couple told them. They claimed that they knew who killed Wayne and Sharman Stock, and it was not Matt Livers and Nicholas Sampson. Based on those interviews with Jessica and Greg, and new evidence that police would uncover over the next 5 months, the police would come to the same conclusion as the teenagers. Matt and Nicholas were innocent. They did not kill Wayne and Sharman Stock. The following is a reconstruction of what actually happened to the Stock couple. But before we get into the rest of the story, I'd like to talk to you about today's sponsors. Okay, back to the story. Back on Saturday, April 15th, 2006, the day before Easter, 17-year-old Jessica Reed and her 19-year-old boyfriend, Greg Fester, left their small apartment in Horrifying, Wisconsin to take a road trip west so they could go see the ocean for the first time. Jessica, who had once been a high school honor student and cheerleader, had dropped out of high school following her parents' divorce. She had started using drugs and began dating Greg, who had a long history of drug and alcohol abuse, as well as an extensive criminal record. Greg was also in and out of treatment for psychiatric disorders. The young couple didn't have a car of their own, so they began their road trip by stealing and then abandoning 2 different vehicles. Apparently, they hadn't liked either of them. They also broke into an empty house and stole a 12-gauge shotgun, ammunition, and an envelope full of cash. They eventually reached a farm where they saw Ryan's red Dodge pickup truck, and the couple thought that vehicle was perfect for them. So Greg hotwired the truck, and he and Jessica hopped in and started to drive west. As they drove, they got high on marijuana, cocaine, and dextromethorphan, which is a stimulant found in cough medication. Eventually, Greg turned the truck and headed southwest to the bordering state of Iowa. It was around this point that the couple stopped talking about wanting to go to the ocean to go see it for the first time. Now they were just solely focused on trying to rob as many people as they possibly could because they wanted money, and it seemed like they kind of enjoyed it. So on their way through Iowa, they robbed 2 more houses, vandalizing the first and stealing another shotgun, ammunition, and $300 from the second house. Then, on April 16th, Easter Day, the couple crossed from Iowa into Nebraska. As the day wore on, the towns they passed through were located very far apart, separated by miles and miles of cornfields or empty tracts of flat land. At this point, they started arguing about what houses they should rob next. Jessica thought they should just take the next thing that comes along because of how far apart everything was. But Greg, who was starting to feel jumpy and irritable as he came down from his massive cough medication high, rejected all of Jessica's suggestions. Feeling annoyed, Jessica just started to ignore him. Jessica had already searched the glove compartment of this truck for money when they first got in, and she hadn't found any. But now that she was bored and kind of angry with Greg, she just reached down and opened the glove compartment again to see if, maybe she had missed something. Feeling around in the back of this glove compartment, Jessica found a man's gold ring with an inscription on the outside of the band that read, "Love always, Corey and Ryan." Jessica, whose shoulder-length blonde hair, childlike face, and small frame made her look more like she was 14 rather than 17, slipped the ring onto her thumb. It was way too big, but she liked it and decided to wear it anyway. As she and Greg drove west across Nebraska and day turned into night, Jessica told Greg he really needed to stop being so picky about what house they were going to rob. There just weren't that many choices. And so finally, in the early morning hours of April 17th, as they drove down another long rural road, Greg suddenly put on the brakes. He could see a white 2-story farmhouse with several outbuildings scattered around it, set back from the road. All the lights were out, and from his perspective, he couldn't see any vehicles parked anywhere nearby, and so to him, that meant no one was home. He turned to Jessica and told her this was it. This was the house they were going to rob. He switched off the headlights of the truck, and then he turned down the Stocks driveway and began moving towards their farmhouse. As they got closer, he told Jessica to grab one of the shotguns just in case there were dogs on the property, and he grabbed the other, making sure both of them were loaded. Then, after he parked the truck in front of the farmhouse, he stuffed a few more shells into the pocket of his jacket and told Jessica to get out of the truck. Crouching down and trying to make as little noise as he could, Greg walked toward the side of the house looking for a way to get inside. And he didn't have to look for very long, because within a couple of minutes, Greg found an unlocked window leading into the laundry room on the first floor. He lifted the screen and crawled through the opening into the house. Then he opened the back door and let Jessica inside. They didn't stay long on the first floor of the house before heading upstairs, but they did stay long enough that while passing through the kitchen, Ryan's gold ring on Jessica's thumb slipped off and rolled out of sight somewhere on the floor. Jessica either didn't notice or didn't try to look for it. The pair quietly made their way up the stairs, but before reaching the top, they stopped. Very clearly, they could hear the sound of someone upstairs snoring. This house was not empty. Without discussing what they were going to do, Greg, who was in the lead, simply just kept on walking up the stairs, and Jessica followed. The couple moved down the second-floor hallway to the master bedroom at the end of the hall where Wayne and Charmin were fast asleep. What happened next, only Greg and Jessica can understand. Greg pushed open the master bedroom door and made no attempt at concealment. Instead, he reached out and flipped the switch on the wall, flooding the bedroom with light. The sound of the door opening and the sudden brightness caused Wayne to wake up, completely alert, his adrenaline flowing even though he had not consciously processed the threat that he and his wife were now facing. Wayne, who was this very stocky and strong-looking guy, began violently trying to rip his covers off so he could get up and confront these people that were in the room with him. And so as Wayne is doing this, Jessica screams at Greg, "Do something!" As Wayne stood up on the bedroom floor, Greg raised his 12-gauge shotgun and he fired a shot into Wayne's kneecap. Even though Wayne's knee was destroyed with bits of bone and flesh poking out of this huge hole where the shot had passed through, Wayne dove toward Greg, shouting as he tried to grab the gun out of Greg's hands. The struggle took them out of the bedroom and into the hallway where Jessica had retreated to, and as the two men wrestled on the ground, Greg yelled at Jessica, "Shoot him!" Jessica didn't hesitate. As Wayne looked up at her, she aimed the shotgun right at his face, and then she fired a single shot into his right eye. A second later, Greg was back up on his feet. He reached down, picked up his shotgun, and he aimed it at Wayne's head, and he fired another shot. This time, literally blowing off the back of Wayne's skull and sending blood spatter all over the stairway wall and creating a silhouette outline of where Jessica, now covered in blood, was standing with her gun in her hands. As soon as Wayne had stopped moving, Greg and Jessica turned their attention back to the master bedroom. They calmly walked back inside and saw Charmin standing next to the bed, crying and screaming hysterically as she desperately tried to call 911 for help. Greg walked across the room until he was standing directly in front of Charmin, who by now was so scared she was just standing there whimpering with the phone in her hand. Greg raised his shotgun until it was level with Charmin's face. Then Greg fired another shot. Despite the shotgun blast blowing off most of Charmin's face, she did not die right away. As Jessica and Greg turned to leave the master bedroom and head back downstairs, Charmin let out a single piercing scream of pure agony that echoed through the house. Covered in blood, with that scream still ringing in their ears, Jessica and Greg stumbled back outside, dropping ammo and shell casings, along with an LED flashlight onto the driveway as they headed for the truck. When they pulled open the doors to the vehicle and clambered inside, their red and silver marijuana pipe rolled off the seat onto the driveway. Greg gunned the engine, and the Dodge Ram pickup truck went speeding away from the Stocks farmhouse. After hearing Jessica's stunning confession that she and her boyfriend, not Matt Livers and Nicholas Sampson, had committed those heinous murders, law enforcement officers in Wisconsin soon discovered more evidence in Jessica's home that linked the teenage lovers to the Stock murders. One piece of evidence was Jessica's journal. On April 22nd, 5 days after she and Greg had killed the Stocks, Jessica had made this entry in her diary. "I killed someone. He was older. I loved it. I wish I could do it all the time. If Greg doesn't watch it, I'm going to leave one day and go do it myself." Police also discovered a letter Jessica had written and left for Greg at their apartment. It was folded up in a cigarette box that also contained a spent 12-gauge shell casing from the murders. In the letter, she wrote, "And this bullet, well, Bunny, it's the only thing left, and I loved it, but that's something we will talk about one day." But even after Jessica and Greg had confessed to the murders, and even though investigators from Wisconsin as well as Nebraska now had a treasure trove of evidence linking the teenagers to the crime, Matt Livers and his cousin Nicholas Sampson still remained incarcerated. Armed with Matt Livers' confession and the speck of Wayne Stock's blood inside the Ford Contour, state and local investigators were sure that Livers and his cousin must have had something to do with this crime. It wasn't until the FBI and lawyers for Matt and Nick stepped in that investigators in Nebraska finally stopped insisting that Matt and Nicholas were also involved in the murders. Lawyers for Matt Livers produced evidence that his confession to killing his aunt and uncle had been coerced, and that he had recanted that confession the day after he made it. It would turn out Matt Livers had an IQ of 63, which meant he was developmentally disabled. And videotapes of his interrogation showed police feeding him the information they wanted him to tell them, until finally, after 11 hours of badgering and threats of facing the death penalty unless he cooperated with police, Matt agreed that he had committed the murders. And when he was pressed by police to name his accomplice, he chose his cousin because Nick had access to a car that matched the description of the light tan vehicle that police said they spotted near the Stocks farmhouse on the morning before the murders were discovered. And even though Matt had been told by police that he failed his lie detector test, in reality, it's likely the results had been misread or misinterpreted. During the first week of October 2006, Nicholas Sampson, who had been incarcerated for the last 5 months, was released and the state dropped all charges against him. 2 months after that, in December, Matt Livers, who had been locked up for the last 7 months, was also released and had his charges dropped as well. In January of 2007, Jessica Reed and Greg Fester both pleaded guilty to 2 counts each of second-degree murder. Before her prison sentence was announced, in a written statement submitted to the judge in her case, Jessica Reed pleaded for mercy, saying that the sound of Charmin Stock's final piercing scream, after her face had been shot off, still woke Jessica up at night. The judge was not moved. On March 19, 2007, Jessica Reed and Greg Fester were both sentenced to life in prison. But before it was all over, there would be one more twist. In late 2007, the FBI got a tip that the legendary crime scene investigator David Kafode most likely planted that single speck of Wayne Stock's blood that had been found during the second search of the Ford Contour. Prior to that blood being found, the only thing police had connecting Matt and Nicholas to the crime were their confessions. And so David planting that blood is what ultimately put them behind bars. On June 2nd, 2010, 3 years after Jessica and Greg went to prison and 4 years after the state of Nebraska finally dropped all charges against Matt Livers and Nicholas Sampson, David Kafode was sentenced to 20 months to 4 years in prison for falsifying evidence in the Stock murder investigation. And in October 2013, faced with civil lawsuits filed by Matt Livers and Nicholas Sampson, the state of Nebraska awarded a $2.5 million settlement to be split between the two men in compensation for their treatment at the hands of Cass County law enforcement officers during the investigation of the Stock murders. As for Andrew Stock, who discovered his parents' bodies on the morning after Easter 2006, justice may have been served, but his family will never recover from their loss. Thank you for... In the fall of 2002, 19-year-old Gemma Houghton moved into her dorm room at the very prestigious University of Manchester in England to begin her freshman year. Her first couple of months at the school were relatively uneventful. She spent all of her time focusing on her studies, and so she really had not gone out and met any new people. But in early 2003, so about halfway through her freshman year, she was standing outside of her dorm when this boy she had never met before walked up to her and introduced himself. He was this tall, very handsome, very charming guy. He said his name was Ian Redmond. He was a senior at the school, and he in fact lived in the same building that she did, and so he just wanted to introduce himself. Now, Gemma was not looking for a boyfriend, but she was immediately attracted to Ian, and Ian would later say the feeling was mutual. This chance encounter would ultimately blossom into a full-fledged romantic relationship, one that would ultimately lead to Ian 6 years later proposing to Gemma on Christmas Eve 2009. That same year they got engaged, the couple, who had diligently saved money for years and years and years, were able to pool their money and buy a house together. It was not a very nice house. It was a fairly beat-up cottage in this little town in England that would need a lot of work, but Ian and Gemma were actually very excited to do the work. They looked at this as an opportunity to make the house exactly the way they wanted it, and it was a chance for them to spend some quality time together. So for the next 2 years, during all of their free time, Ian and Gemma would work on their home, and then finally in August of 2011, right before their actual wedding day, they finished the renovation. Their home is done. And so they get married, and then literally right after their wedding, instead of going right into a honeymoon, they just moved right into their dream home that night. And so for the next couple of days, the newlyweds got to enjoy being husband and wife for the first time inside of their dream home, and then it was time to go on the honeymoon. In addition to having set aside money for the down payment on their home, the couple had also set aside money for this honeymoon. They wanted it to be an amazing vacation. And so what they decided to do for their honeymoon was to go to Seychelles, which is this island nation in the Indian Ocean, which many say has the most beautiful beaches in the world. So on August 10th, the couple hops on a plane and they fly to Seychelles. And when they land, they check into their resort, which is this unbelievable place that overlooks this perfect beach with white sand and crystal clear waters. And then after getting checked in, the couple goes down to a restaurant and they're having a bite to eat. And as they're sitting there, they're probably thinking to themselves, this is going to be the best vacation ever. During the first week of their trip, the couple was very active, spending lots of time exploring the island and going out on different excursions and going to lots of restaurants. They were just all over the place. And so come Tuesday, August 16th, which was the start of their second week and final week of this honeymoon, the couple was kind of tired from all the activity. And so they decided they would just have a lazy day at the beach that day. And so the couple grabbed their swimsuits and their towels and their chairs, and they left the resort and headed down to the beach right outside. And then after finding a decent spot on the sand, they set up their chairs and towels, put their stuff down, and And Gemma, she laid down on one of the chairs to begin sunbathing, and Ian, he grabbed his fins and his snorkel, and he kissed Gemma on the cheek and said he was going to go down to the water and go for a swim. Gemma remembers watching Ian as he walked across the beach and stopped in front of the water and put on his big fins and got his snorkel on, and then he kind of awkwardly duck walked his way into the water. And Gemma remembers just smiling and laughing to herself, watching him awkwardly do this, and then thinking to herself how lucky she was to be married to such an amazing guy. She really loved him so much. After Ian had finally gotten into the water and had begun his snorkeling journey, Gemma laid back and began to doze off to sleep. A little while later, though, Gemma suddenly woke up to the sound of what almost sounded like someone sneezing really, really loudly. And so instinctively, she sat up and scanned the waterline for her husband, but all she saw were other tourists in the water swimming and snorkeling and doing all sorts of stuff. She couldn't find Ian. And then she heard a male voice calling out for help, and it was coming off to the right towards the top of the beach, pretty far away from her. And she turned and she saw Ian. Ian was about 60 feet off of the sand, so he's well out into the water, and he appeared to be kind of hunched forward with his arm kind of in the water, and he's waving his other arm in the air. It was like he was stuck on something, and before Gemma could get up and run to him or help him in any way, Ian just begins to scream at the top of his lungs. When Ian began screaming, there was a surgeon who was also on vacation at this beach who was in a boat near where Ian was. He hears the scream and he boats over to Ian, and he and the guy who was in the boat with him managed to pull Ian out of the water. They get him on the boat, and Ian is alive and he's conscious, but he is missing his entire left arm. He's missing the majority of his left thigh, and there was a huge chunk missing from his midsection. It would turn out Ian had been attacked by a bull shark, one of the most aggressive sharks in the world. That sneezing sound that Gemma had heard that had startled her awake was the sound Ian had made through his snorkel when the shark bit down on him. The surgeon rushed Ian to the shore and pulled him out and got him onto the sand and began trying to save his life. At the same time, Gemma had come running up the beach, and she managed to push through the quickly forming crowd, and she drops down next to her husband. And Ian at this point is alive and he's conscious. He's very badly hurt, but he's looking up and he's clearly making eye contact with Gemma, and Gemma, she's looking down at her husband and she's making clear eye contact with him, and they don't really say much. It was like this horrible moment where all they could do was just be in the moment together. And so during this kind of silent acknowledgement, Ian would ultimately pass away. It would turn out, over the past few weeks, there had been a rash of shark attacks at this beach, including one other fatal attack on another tourist. Because shark attacks in Seychelles were so unheard of, they believed this had to be the work of one rogue bull shark. That was the one shark that was doing all of these attacks. And so because this shark had not been captured or killed, the country had actually instituted a temporary ban on swimming at this beach and a few other beaches. But for whatever reason, the ban had not been communicated effectively to the tourists, nor had it been enforced on the tourists. And so Gemma and Ian had no idea the water was a dangerous place to be. They just looked out and saw other tourists swimming around and believed it was totally safe, when in reality, it obviously wasn't. Gemma would quickly return to England, and she would host her husband's funeral in the same church she and he had been married in 10 days earlier. In 1986, 35 million Americans went to see the brand new movie Crocodile Dundee, which was a comedy that starred this very capable and rugged Australian crocodile hunter who goes to New York City. One of the 35 million Americans who saw this film was a 24-year-old model from Virginia named Ginger Meadows. And after seeing this film, Ginger felt inspired to actually go to Australia to see it for herself because it looked so amazing in this movie. So a couple of months later, in March of 1987, Ginger, by herself, hops on a plane and flies to Perth, which is a major city in Western Australia. And her plan was she would land in Australia and then work odd jobs to make a little bit of cash, and then use that cash to fund her travels all over the country. And then at some point, after she was tired of doing that, she would head back to the United States. So she lands in Perth, and immediately she sees her first opportunity to make some money. There had been this huge sailing competition in the city leading up to the weekend she arrived there. And so she saw all these luxury yachts anchored at all these docks along the coastline. And Ginger's thinking to herself, these huge ships, they have crews that work on them basically full time. Maybe one of these boats could use an extra set of hands. And so Ginger, who's very friendly and outgoing, she went right down to one of these docks and she stopped in front of the very first yacht she saw, which was this huge luxury 100-foot yacht. And she introduced herself to the captain of this boat. And she said, hey, can I hitch a ride with you guys to the next place you're going? And in exchange, I'll work for you. And as it happened, the captain was actually looking for another crew member to assist their chef. And so he said, okay, well, can you cook? And Ginger said, yeah, I'm a great cook. And he said, okay, well, you're hired. You can be the chef's assistant. And so Ginger, she climbs on board and she meets the rest of the 5 other crew members, including the chef who she'd be working with. And the chef's name was Jane, and those two would become very close. And then shortly after Ginger had come aboard, the captain cast off their lines and they headed out to sea. Their next stop was going to be New Guinea, which was roughly 14 days of travel away. After about a week at sea, the captain realized they were dangerously low on fresh water. And so he decided to take a detour and turn east and head inland along this river system that would bring them to this large freshwater pool, which he also knew had this huge waterfall that dumped down into it. And so he figured they could go right underneath this waterfall and fill up their jugs with all this fresh water and then head back out and they'd be good. So on the morning of March 29th, the captain anchored the yacht out at sea near the mouth of this river system, and then he lowered the yacht's dinghy, which was a smaller, more agile boat. And once that was in the water, he, Ginger, Jane, and the rest of the crew, they hop in this dinghy along with all these large empty water jugs, and they begin making their way towards this river. And so they're traveling up this river for a little while, and then finally they get to this huge freshwater pool, and right in front of them is this amazing waterfall, and everybody is just totally awestruck by this waterfall. It's like a gem in the middle of nowhere, because they're in very rugged Australia at this point. And so the captain, he brings the dinghy right near the base of the waterfall, and one by one they hold up their water jugs and they fill them with fresh water, and then they're about to turn and go back out to sea and get back on their yacht when the captain thinks to himself, you know what, we've been at sea for 7 days straight, it's been very monotonous, maybe it would be a good thing to stick around here for a little bit longer and maybe even hike up to the top of this waterfall and enjoy the view and kind of enjoy the scenery before we head back out to sea. And so he says to his crew, hey, do you guys want to go to the top of this waterfall? And everyone agrees it's a great idea, with the exception of Jane. She did not feel like hiking to the top of this waterfall. She said she would stay down in the dinghy and wait for them. Now, this pool is basically surrounded on all sides by just pure cliff face. There really is no place to land this dinghy. There's no flat surfaces. You basically have cliffs that go directly into water, and then also you have the river that feeds back out to the ocean. So the captain brings the dinghy right up against the cliff face right next to this waterfall, and he and Ginger and the other crew members not named Jane climb out of the dinghy onto this cliff face, and they begin climbing, literally climbing up this wall towards the top of the waterfall. Now, everyone was able to do it except for Ginger. She kept slipping on the rocks. It was very steep. It seemed kind of dangerous. And so at some point, she abandons the idea and goes back down to the dinghy with Jane, and the captain and the rest of the crew, they continue up towards the top. And so as Ginger and Jane are sitting in the dinghy watching the other crew members making their way up, they start feeling a little bit left out, and they're like, you know what? Let's try to find an alternate way up to the top of this waterfall. And so they begin scanning out across this pool at the other cliffs kind of surrounding it, and it looked like on the very other side of the pool, there was a less severe cliff face that maybe they would have an easier time climbing up. And so the two women, they jump into the murky brown water and begin swimming directly across this pool towards this other cliff. And when they make it about a third of the way, Jane suddenly stops, and Ginger notices and turns around and looks at Jane, and she's like, what's going on? And Jane would tell her, you know, something just feels off. This doesn't feel right. Let's go back to the dinghy. Let's just forget about this. But Ginger is like, come on, we're so close. Let's just keep going. It'll be awesome once we get to the top of this waterfall. And so Jane, she's totally hesitant, but she says, okay, fine. And they both continue to swim. And then all of a sudden, they hear their captain, who is now on top of the waterfall, screaming down to them to get out of the water right now. And they notice notice he is pointing down at the pool in a direction slightly away from where they were. And so they're looking up at him and they're following his finger down to the part of the pool he's pointing at, and they see there is this tidal wave of water coming towards them. It is a 12-foot long saltwater crocodile that has noticed them, and it is charging straight at them. Now, Jane and Ginger knew they were too far away from the dinghy to be able to swim to it before this crocodile was going to reach them, and so their next best choice was just to turn and swim towards the nearest cliff face, because again, there is no place to get out of the water. There's only cliffs. And so they swim towards this cliff face, which is right on the edge of the bottom of the waterfall, and so water is landing on them, and they reach the cliff face, and they're trying to climb up and pull themselves out of the water, but there's nowhere to grab onto. It's all totally slick. There's no good handholds, and so all they have is this little ledge that is in the water that they're standing on, but they're still halfway into the water. And so after they struggle for a minute trying to pull themselves out of the water and they realize they can't do it, they both just turn around and they lock arms and they look out through the water that's falling down in front of them into the pool, and they see this crocodile has followed them, and it is now stopped right on the other side of the water that's falling down, and it's just staring at them with its mouth wide open. And the two women are looking at it. They don't know what to do. And the captain and the other crew members, they see what's going on, and they're trying to climb down as fast as they possibly can to try to rescue them. But it's going to take several minutes at least before they get down to the dinghy. And so Jane and Ginger, they're totally aware of this, and they're just staring at this crocodile, screaming at it, trying to get it to go away. And at some point, the crocodile does just close its mouth and sink below the surface. But now they don't know where it is, and this causes Ginger to completely panic, and she lets go of Jane's arm, and she dives into the water off to the right and attempts to swim away from the crocodile back over to the boat. But Ginger only made it 2 strokes before the crocodile suddenly re-emerged underneath her and grabbed her by the waist and pulled her under the water. Jane is just standing there watching all of this happen in front of her. She has no idea what to do. The crew is still not down in the dinghy, so she's totally stranded, and she's just staring at the area where Ginger has been pulled below the surface. And just seconds after she's been pulled under, the crocodile re-emerges with its head pointed towards Jane, and in its jaws is Ginger. And Ginger's got her arms up over her head. She's wide-eyed, and she's looking right at Jane. And Jane makes eye contact with her, but there's nothing she can do. And she just watched as Ginger again was pulled back under, and this time she did not come up again. Ultimately, Jane would be rescued from the ledge. The crew would get down to the dinghy, they'd swing over, they would pick her up, and then about 2 days later, they would find what was left of Ginger's remains. It would turn out the captain was well aware of the threat the crocodiles posed in this river, and he had told his crew, Ginger and Jane included, about this threat, and that at no point should anyone get in this water. But of course, his warning went unheeded. If you Google the words Burning Man and you click on images, you'll see lots of scantily clad and somewhat wild-looking people roaming around the Nevada desert on strange-looking bikes, and in the background, you'll see all these huge, bizarre statues of aliens and robots and animals, and these statues are often draped in more wild-looking people, or these statues are on fire, and these wild-looking people are dancing and rejoicing all around the flames. Based on these images, you might think Burning Man is just some totally weird substance-fueled party out in the middle of the desert. And while that is true to some degree, it's not totally accurate. Burning Man is not a party. It's actually an experiment that 70,000 people from all over the world participate in every year. The question this experiment is trying to answer is, can a random segment of the population come together and build a community out of nothing in the middle of nowhere? And can they do it while knowing at the end of Burning Man, which is always 9 days long, everything they build, the sculptures, the shelters, everything will be torn down and destroyed and erased from the planet as if it had never been there in the first place. And amazingly, year after year after year, the answer to this question is yes. Yes, they can. As soon as these 70,000 people descend on this small section of the Nevada desert, they immediately get to work helping each other, building their own sites. I mean, these people largely don't know each other, or in many cases, they don't even speak the same language, but they're showing up with this shared desire to build this temporary community. And so they begin seamlessly working together. And while shelters are being stood up all over the place, other attendees will pull out instruments and form impromptu bands, and then the artists of the group will get together and begin building these kind of strange sculptures. And so very quickly, within only a few hours, every year in Burning Man, this plot of barren desert turns into this beautiful otherworldly utopia full of totally happy and fulfilled and excited strangers. But in 2017, the utopia that was created at that Burning Man was shattered by one man, and his name was Aaron Joel. In 2017, Aaron Joel was a tall, handsome, 41-year-old free spirit who, from the time he was just a little kid, had this sort of restless energy about him. He always needed to be out doing stuff. He could never sit still. And so by the time he was old enough, he left his family home in Oklahoma and moved out to Oregon and moved into this commune. A commune is a group of people that live together and share their possessions and responsibilities. But shortly after moving into this commune, Aaron got restless again. This wasn't enough for him, and so he left the commune and began traveling all over the United States. But after he had basically gone everywhere in the country, he became restless again, and so he left the United States and he went to Nepal and began traveling all over Nepal. And while he was there, he met this wonderful young woman from Switzerland named Ladina, and the two fell madly in love. And then when it was time for Ladina to leave Nepal and go back to her home country, Aaron followed her. And just a couple of years later, in 2014, the pair got married and they bought a house together and settled down in Switzerland. For a time, Aaron and Ladina were very happy. Their life was very simple and straightforward. They loved each other. They loved Switzerland. But in 2017, Aaron's wanderlust reared its head again. And so he went up to Ladina and he told her that, honey, I need to go out and explore again. I need to go out and be free again. Even if it's just for a couple of days or a week or whatever time it is, I need it. I need it in order to be sane. I don't think Ladina was very pleased about this development. However, she knew her husband and she knew this was important to him and to his mental health. And so she said, okay, honey, you do what you have to do. And so Aaron thought about what he was going to do to satiate this desire to go out and be free again, and he settled on attending that year's Burning Man, something he had never done before. So Aaron leaves Switzerland and he goes back to Oregon in the United States, and he meets up with a very close friend of his named Justin. Justin was actually someone he had lived with in the commune when he was there. And so the two, they link up in Oregon, and from there, they drive in Justin's big van out to Nevada. And when they get to Nevada, they drive out to the Burning Man site. And as they're pulling up, they see thousands and thousands of other vans and tents and all these people that are out setting up and building this community, this utopia. And so right away, Aaron and Justin, they find their spot, they park their van, they begin to build their own site. And then after that, they pulled their bikes out of the van and began biking around, helping other people out build their sites and build the rest of the community. And so by that afternoon, Aaron and Justin had made lots of new friends, and they were out partying and dancing and singing with total strangers, just totally immersed in the Burning Man experience. That night, Aaron would actually turn in early while Justin would stay up and continue having a good time with the new people he had met. Aaron was just not a night owl. He liked to get a full night's sleep and then get up early and make himself a smoothie and do yoga. And so this was very normal behavior. Justin would later say that he really looked up to Aaron. And in fact, many people that knew Aaron looked up to him because Aaron, on the one hand, was a total free spirit that would just kind of go where the wind would blow him. But at the same time, he was very regimented and disciplined. He took great care of himself, both physically and mentally, and he just seemed wise beyond his years. And he was incredibly charismatic and very funny, and so people really flocked to him and really idolized him. One of the traditions of Burning Man has to do with its namesake. Towards the end of every Burning Man, they will build this 40-foot tall wooden man effigy, and they will burn it to the ground, hence the name Burning Man. And so on the night night of the so-called man burn, Aaron told Justin that he was not going to turn in early that night, that instead he was going to stay up and watch the spectacle of this effigy being burned to the ground. Justin was really excited about it, and so was Aaron. And so that evening, Aaron and Justin met up with their new friends they had met while they were at Burning Man, and their group began making their way over to the wooden man effigy. Now, this huge effigy was situated in this huge open clearing, and then standing all around this wooden man are what they called rangers. They're basically security guards for the event that also have some fire training, and they would stand almost shoulder to shoulder or very close to shoulder, facing away from the effigy, forming a perimeter around it. And the rangers' job was to prevent the crowd of 70,000 people from getting too close to the effigy when it was on fire, because it's obviously a huge hazard. And so Aaron, Justin, and their friends, when they got to this clearing and saw the effigy, they would have seen thousands and thousands of event attendees converging on this effigy, getting as close to the rangers as they possibly could on all sides. And so Aaron and Justin and their friends, they make their way up to one particular section of this crowd, and they begin fighting their way through all these people, trying to get as close to the rangers as they possibly could, because they want a good view of this man burn. And then once they were satisfied with their view, they just stopped and waited for the effigy to be lit. But before the effigy was lit, Aaron would turn to Justin and say, "Hey, I have some friends from Switzerland who are here right now. They're on the other side of the effigy, on the other side of the crowd, and I'm going to go see them right now." And so Justin was totally bummed that Aaron was going to be leaving right before this thing is lit, because he wanted to experience this with Aaron. But he said, "Okay, no problem. I'll see you hopefully, before this thing gets lit, or, I'll see you after this burn is done." And so Aaron departed the group, and Justin watched as he kind of disappeared into the crowd. And then Justin turned his attention back towards the effigy, and a little while later, when the sun had gone down and it was totally dark out and the crowd was totally electric as they're waiting for this thing to light, finally they did. They lit the effigy, and as soon as it went up in flames, the crowd of thousands and thousands of people roared with excitement. And this whole time, Justin is totally amazed by what he is watching, but he's also scanning the crowd, kind of hoping that Aaron will eventually pop back up. But at this point, the crowd is so massive and everyone's so tight together that Justin is really not expecting Aaron to come back over to where he had been. It just didn't seem possible. And so this huge wooden man effigy goes up in glorious flames, and everyone's so amazed by it. And then eventually the flames begin to dwindle down as the structure continues to burn lower and lower to the ground. And then finally, when the fire is just about out, the crowd of people begin to disperse. And at this point, Justin again looks around hoping to maybe see Aaron, but Aaron has not come back yet. And so Justin just says, "Okay, maybe it's time to leave and go check in with Aaron back at the van." And so he notifies his friends that he's going to turn around and head back. And as Justin turns and begins leaving the crowd, someone who was at the event, who apparently knew Justin and knew Aaron, came running over to Justin and frantically told him this totally shocking story about something that happened to Aaron. Now, at first, Justin just could not believe it. He couldn't even process it. It seemed so outlandish and unbelievable that it just could not have happened. But he was thinking to himself, I haven't seen Aaron since he left to go see his friends from Switzerland, and I have no idea where he is. And so Justin starts looking around the crowd again. He's not seeing Aaron, and he's starting to panic. And so finally, Justin just turns and starts running back towards his van in hopes that Aaron is going to be there. But when he gets back to his van, Aaron is not there, and there's no sign that Aaron has been back after they had left for the man burn. It would turn out that shocking story Justin had been told about Aaron was true. This is that shocking story. After Aaron told Justin that he was going to go to the other side of the crowd and spend some time with his friends from Switzerland, he disappeared from the group and he made his way over to that far side of the crowd. But we don't know if he actually met up with friends from Switzerland or if that was just some cover to get away from Justin and the other people he was with. But regardless, at some point, Aaron made his way over to the other side of the effigy, away from Justin and away from his other friends. And once he was over there, he pushed his way towards the front of the crowd until he was right in front of the rangers with front row seats of the effigy. And then after the effigy was set alight and was fully engulfed in flames, Aaron, at some point, bum rushed one of the rangers right in front of him and was able to push past him. And then before that ranger or any other nearby rangers could stop him, Aaron was able to sprint directly into the bottom of this massive effigy, right into the fire, and he disappeared inside of it. Because the crowd was massive and unruly and many people were under the influence of drugs or alcohol or both, because of all of that, even though Aaron is running into the fire right in front of them, it was like nobody noticed. Everybody was in kind of their own worlds, and it's dark out, there's this fire. I mean, there's so many distractions that really nobody noticed this happening besides the rangers that were immediately affected by Aaron running past them and some of the people that were right at the front of the crowd watching as Aaron did this. And so this is why Justin and the rest of his friends had no idea this had happened, despite the fact they were watching this fire as this was happening. Aaron would ultimately only be inside of the flames for 12 seconds before the rangers were able to go inside and pull him out. But by that time, it was already too late. Aaron would be rushed to the hospital, but he would die that night. It would later be determined that Aaron was completely sober at the time he decided to run into the burning man, which means he was of clear mind when he decided to do this. And so it was determined that his death had to be a suicide. However, his family and his friends and anybody who knew him are just totally not buying the idea that he decided to commit suicide, especially like this. It just didn't make any sense. This is not something Aaron would have done. He was acting totally normally. His behavior was not erratic. Something else must have caused this to happen. But unfortunately, at this point, no one has come close to figuring out what this other thing could be. And so to date, his death still remains largely a mystery. Here is a picture one of the bystanders took of Aaron as he charges into the fire. In early 2020, a very popular Russian Instagram influencer named Ekterina Didenko was getting ready to celebrate her 29th birthday. She, along with her husband and some of her influencer friends, were planning to enjoy the occasion at a popular spa in Moscow, Russia. The group rented out a private section of the spa that included a steam room and a small indoor pool. And then once the reservations were made, Didenko and all of her influencer friends began eagerly talking about how excited they were about this party on their various social media accounts. When the day finally came, February 28th, which was Didenko's birthday, Didenko, her husband, and the 8 other people they invited, they all descended on this spa. So they go inside, they go back to their private area, and it's great. There's food, there's alcohol, there's music, they're jumping into the pool and getting in the hot tub, and everyone's just having a great time. Everyone's taking pictures and filming and live streaming. I mean, it's really going as well as it possibly could be. And then at some point, Didenko's husband signals the rest of the group, minus Didenko, and they all begin to pull out these white hazardous materials suits. Imagine what you would see in a movie if there was some huge chemical leak, a full body white suit with a mask. And so they're all putting on these hazmat suits, and they give one to Didenko, who puts it on as well, and they tell her this is part of her big surprise. Now, it's unclear if Didenko actually didn't know what was going to happen next, or if she's just pretending to be surprised because it would do better on social media, because this is all being filmed and she's an influencer. But either way, she puts on her hazmat suit, and once everyone has their suits on, Didenko's husband wheeled in this huge cooler like you would bring to a picnic, and he placed it right on the edge of the pool. When he opened the lid, the crowd all gasped and laughed and smiled and filmed as these huge clouds of smoke or steam came pouring out of it. What it was roughly 55 pounds of dry ice. Dry ice is just frozen carbon dioxide. It's commonly used for things like refrigerating perishable goods for long periods of time because dry ice stays cold for a really long time. Also, because of the huge white gas clouds that come off of dry ice, it's also very commonly used as a sort of spooky decoration because you have these very cool white clouds going everywhere. And in fact, that's what Didenko's husband planned to use this dry ice for. He was going to dump it into the pool and create those big white gas clouds all over the pool. The reason they call it dry ice is because as it starts to heat up, it doesn't melt into a liquid state the way frozen water does. Instead, it goes directly from a solid state to a gas state. Dry ice is considered to be quite hazardous if it's handled inappropriately, and while these partygoers all had their hazmat suits on, it's unlikely they were actually wearing them for safety. It's far more likely they were wearing them because it would look good on social media and would kind of hype up the stunt they were about to do. And so after the dry ice was revealed inside of this cooler, Didenko's husband and another of the partygoers grabbed the sides of the cooler and they dumped its contents directly into the water. And as soon as the dry ice hit the water, it rapidly began to warm up, which caused a massive, almost explosion of carbon dioxide gas to completely fill the lower half of the room. Now, none of the partygoers are even a little bit fazed by what's happening. They don't realize how dangerous this actually is. And so they're just filming and laughing and kind of thinking this is so funny. And then Didenko's husband actually leaps through the cloud into the water and kind of disappears below. And then shortly after that, two other partygoers would also leap into the pool. One of the main reasons dry ice is considered to be so hazardous if handled inappropriately is because dry ice emits that carbon dioxide gas, which at high concentrations will displace oxygen. So imagine if you're in a very small room that has very poor ventilation. If you had lots of carbon dioxide in there, you would suffocate. And so this indoor pool was a small confined space with poor ventilation. And so the 7 people on the pool deck, shortly after this dry ice has been tossed into the pool, they started to realize it was really hard to breathe because the oxygen was basically being sucked out of the room. And so they were able to turn and actually run out of the pool deck before it was too late. Meanwhile, Didenko's husband and the other 2 people who leapt into the pool, when they came back to the surface, they breathed in thinking they would be breathing in oxygen, but instead they breathed in an entire lungful of carbon dioxide, which in addition to displacing oxygen at higher concentrations inside of confined spaces with poor ventilation, it is also poisonous at higher concentrations inside of confined spaces with poor ventilation. And so when the 3 of them surfaced, they breathed in this poisonous gas, which caused 2 of them to immediately pass out and then just die, while the third, Didenko's husband, he managed to stay conscious enough that he was able to climb barely out of the pool, and he tried to get to the door, but he couldn't get out in time. Eventually, he was pulled out and rushed to the hospital, but he would later die, not only from carbon dioxide poisoning, but also from having gone without oxygen for as long as he had. On Saturday, September 30th, 2017, a staff member at a North Wales country club noticed water leaking out of the bottom of an outside wall of one of their many bungalows. These bungalows, which were generally just vacation rentals, were single-story white structures situated up on this beautiful green hillside. The staff member, after seeing this leak, they just turn around and go back to the front office and they tell their boss about it, and then shortly after, 2 maintenance workers were sent out to check on this leak. And so these 2 workers, they go over to this bungalow and they knock on the front door. But after a while, when no one comes to the door, they pull out their master key and they begin to turn the lock. And as they do that, they yell out just in case, hey, we're here just to check on a leak. We have to come in. It's a potential emergency. And so they open up the door, they swing it open, and no one comes to the door. It's still silent. And they're looking into this property. And what they see is on the left, from their perspective, is a kitchen. And on their right is a living room. It was basically one big room that had been designated for 2 distinct functions. And so they yelled out again into this bungalow, hey, we're coming inside, we're just checking on this leak. And then they just walked straight across past the living room and past the kitchen to the back of this property where they reached a door. And this door led into a bedroom and this door was shut. And so just as a precaution, they knocked on the bedroom door, but nobody came to the door again. So they opened up the bedroom door and they looked into this room. And on the right side of the room, tucked up against the right wall, were 2 twin beds where the head of each bed was tucked up against the wall. And then in the middle of the room, at the base of these 2 beds, was a pile of unopened luggage. And so to the 2 maintenance workers, this told them that someone clearly was staying in this bungalow. Either they had just arrived or they were getting ready to leave, but apparently they were not there right now. And so the workers walked around the luggage and around the 2 beds. So they walked on the left side of the room all the way to the back where there was another closed door, and it went into the bathroom. And based on where the leak had been coming out of the structure, they believed it would be coming from this particular bathroom. And so again, they get up to this door and they knock on it because, they want to make sure no one's in there, but there's more silence. And so they open up the bathroom and right away they see water all over the bathroom floor. But as they scan around the bathroom, they look at the sink, they look at the shower, the toilet, none of them are overflowing or running. So it was not any of the usual suspects that had caused this leak. However, there was one other area in the bathroom that could have caused a water leak, and that was the airing cupboard. An airing cupboard is typically where you keep a hot water heater. It's basically like a walk-in closet where the majority of the space is taken up by this heater. And also generally people put in shelves in front of the heater to store their linens and towels and that sort of thing. And in this bungalow, the airing cupboard had its own door and it was right in the bathroom, and this door to the airing cupboard was right to the left of the door that led into the bathroom from the bedroom. And so these two workers, they reached over and they opened the door that led into this airing cupboard. And as soon as it swung in, they could tell right away where the leak was coming from. And they could tell right away they had a much, much bigger problem. 7 days earlier, 60-year-old former policewoman Mary Isherwood arrived at the North Wales Country Club. She and her ex-husband had for a long time owned one of these bungalows. However, they almost never stayed in it. They basically used it as an income property, renting it out to vacation goers. But they had recently decided that they wanted to actually sell the property. And so before the sale became final, Mary had told her ex-husband that she just wanted to go and spend a week actually enjoying the property and actually take a vacation there. And so originally, she and some friends were going to go to this bungalow and spend a week there. But right before they were going to leave, Mary's friends all said they couldn't make it. And so Mary decided she would just go on her own. And so Mary arrives at this country club. It's late at night when she gets there. She gets to the bungalow. She puts her luggage down in her bedroom. And then instead of just kind of getting settled in and going to sleep, she decides she's going to go exercise. Mary was incredibly fit and healthy. She loved playing golf and running and exercising in general. And she knew the club had a pool. And so she reached into her luggage and she just pulled out a bathing suit. She switched into that and then she went down to the pool and did some lap swimming. After that, she came back to her room where she took a shower and then she climbed in bed without any clothes on. That was just how Mary liked to sleep. And then at some point in the middle of the night, Mary woke up to go use the bathroom. And so she hopped out of her twin bed. She walked around to the door that led into the bathroom. She went inside, she did her business. And then afterwards, as she was attempting to go back into her bedroom, she accidentally grabbed the door handle of the airing cupboard, which was right to the left of the door leading back to her bedroom. She opened it up, it swung inward. She stepped into the airing cupboard, which was totally pitch black. And as she walked in, she might have bumped into the shelves or realized, this was the wrong turn. But as soon as this happened, the door behind her had actually shut. And so she's inside of this tiny airing cupboard, realizing, okay, this is not where I need to go. I've made a silly mistake. She turned around to grab the door handle to open the airing cupboard back up again. But when she grabbed the knob, it disintegrated in her hands. It broke into multiple parts and fell to the ground. Now, the space she is in is pitch black. She has no way of knowing which parts go where for this doorknob. And so by touch, she reached down and she grabbed all these pieces and she probably tried to put them together and put it back on this door to try to get it open, but she just couldn't do it. And so eventually, Mary would have realized this is a pretty serious situation. She was staying at this bungalow by herself, and she was not expected to check out for another week. So no one was going to be checking on her, and without this doorknob, she could not open this closet door. It was a hard wooden door, the locking mechanism was solid, there was just no way to open it without this doorknob. And so Mary began banging on the door and screaming out for help, but her bungalow was not actually connected to any other structures. It was a standalone. And so her voice did not carry very far, and the banging sounds she was making, those also did not carry very far. And so no one heard her. And so after several hours, she's just standing in this closet, probably thinking to herself, how in the world did I get myself in this position? But after the initial shock of this totally bizarre situation she was in had worn off, she decided to act.
And so she turned away from the door and she faced towards the back of this closet. She would have been face to face with a row of shelves, but she wouldn't have been able to see the shelves because it was totally dark. And then beyond the shelves, farther into this closet, was the actual hot water heater. There was no wall behind the shelves. Basically, there was a space behind the shelves where this heater was. And so Mary grabbed one of these shelves and she managed to break it off the wall. And then she turned around and used this piece of wood and tried to smash the door, but very quickly realized that was just going to do nothing. However, she began striking the wall right next to the door, and she realized she could break through the drywall. She was starting to kind of burrow a hole. And so maybe she thought to herself, if I can just build a hole big enough right next to the door, I can reach through the hole and maybe open this cupboard from the outside. And so she began using this shelf to smash this wall, and she's burrowing as fast as she can, but the progress must have been very, very slow because she decides she needs a different tool. So she turns back around, so she's facing the shelves again, and she breaks down a few more shelves to clear a path to get to the water heater. And then once she could step past the shelves, once there was a path, she got right in front of this water heater, and then by touch began feeling around for any pipes extending off of the heater. And when she found one, she got a good grip of it, and she began yanking and tugging on it until she managed to rip a piece of pipe off of the hot water heater. Now, as soon as she did that, she now had a pipe that was a far better tool for burrowing and creating this hole in the wall. However, as soon as that pipe broke off, cold water began leaking out of this hot water heater, the water that had not been heated yet, and it was being sprayed all over the inside of this cupboard. Now, this was a very small space, and so there was no way for Mary to get out from under this cold water, and so it was a shocking and probably very painful experience. But she now had her tool and figured, okay, this is awful, but I'll just use this tool, I'll burrow this hole, I'll get this cupboard open, and I'll get out of here. And so with the water raining down on her, Mary used her new piece of pipe and began digging and burrowing at that spot right next to the door. But after a while, probably several hours, she struck a brick wall. There was no way she could actually push through this wall and reach around and open the cupboard door. There was nothing she could do. It was a dead end. And so totally devastated and probably very exhausted from all the energy she used to burrow this hole, she stopped. She's still getting rained down on by all this freezing cold water. And instead of just totally giving up, she just turned and faced the wall that was leading into her bedroom. She began digging again, using this tool all over again to now dig a new hole on this other wall, most likely hoping that she could literally burrow a hole big enough that she could actually crawl through into her bedroom and escape. And so after several more hours of digging as fast and as hard as she could, while also periodically banging on the door and screaming out for help, she did eventually push through into her bedroom. However, in a cruel twist of fate, when she did finally poke through this wall, there was no bricks in the way, she hit what felt like another dead end. But in fact, what it was a picture frame with a glass cover across it had been screwed onto the wall in her bedroom. And this painting was right over where she was digging this hole. And so in her totally exhausted and panicked and saddened and scared state, she hits the back of this painting. And again, it's pitch black and she's feeling through the hole most likely, and she's touching this hard back of this painting. And she's realizing, oh my goodness, I've hit another dead end. There's nowhere for me to go. Even though in reality, she could have very easily just broken through that frame and then maybe made the hole a little bit bigger, and then she could have squeezed through it and escaped. But she didn't know that, and so she eventually just slouched to the ground and accepted her fate. 6 days later, when those two maintenance workers opened the airing cupboard door, they found Mary's body slumped up against the wall inside this closet. She had died of hypothermia. It would turn out other residents of the other bungalows nearby heard banging coming from this bungalow on Saturday night, the night that Mary actually got stuck, and then they also heard the banging the following morning, on Sunday morning. But none of the other residents reported it because they believed it was just construction or some other maintenance work. However, there was one couple staying in one of the nearby bungalows that thought there was something off about this banging, and they told each other, if the banging persists past 5 p.m. on Sunday, so that's the day after Mary got stuck,
This couple told each other that if it continues past 5 p.m., we'll report it. But as it happened, Mary stopped banging on the walls and yelling for help right around 5 p.m. on Sunday. And so this couple, right as they're getting ready to go tell the front desk, the banging stopped, and so they stopped worrying about it. It's unclear how long Mary survived after she stopped banging around 5 p.m. on Sunday. It could have been minutes, it could have been hours, it could have been days. Mary's family would ultimately sue the country club for negligence. However, the outcomes of this case have not been made public. On July 30th, 2013, 56-year-old Roger Miro grabbed a bag of trash from his apartment and then walked out into the hall. He turned right and walked down the hall until he reached the trash chute, which was right on the side of the wall. He opened it up. It was like a mailbox. He opened it up. He dropped his trash bag inside. He closed the trash chute and then walked back to his apartment. When he got back inside, he instinctively reached down to his right pocket to grab his cell phone, but it wasn't there. So he grabbed his left pocket, wasn't there either. He checked his back pockets, he's fishing around, and he realizes he doesn't have his phone. So he figures, okay, I must have put it down somewhere in my apartment. Now, Roger was legally blind, so it made looking for small things in his apartment quite difficult. But nonetheless, he began looking all over his apartment for his phone. He started in the kitchen, he looked all over the place, checked all the surfaces, no cell phone. He went to the living room, to the bedroom, to the bathroom, but there was no cell phone. And so Roger thought maybe when he walked to the trash chute, he might have dropped the phone in the hallway. And so he left his apartment, he turned right, and he walked along, retracing his footsteps all the way to the trash chute. But all along the way, there was no phone on the ground. And so as he's standing in front of the opening to this trash chute, he thinks to himself, maybe I accidentally put my phone in the trash bag that I have now just dropped down this trash chute. And so as Roger is standing there wondering what he's supposed to do, one of his neighbors walked out into the hall and looked down and saw Roger standing there kind of inquisitively looking at this opening to the trash chute. And they asked Roger, what's going on? And Roger explained the whole phone situation. And the neighbor said, well, hey, why don't you go down to the first floor and ask the manager if you can get the key to the trash room on the first floor where all the trash goes. And so Roger said, thank you very much. He turned and made his way to the elevator, and the neighbor went back inside of his apartment. Roger went down to the first floor. He went to the manager's office. He knocked on the door. And when the door opened, the manager was obviously very busy with something. And Roger would say, hey, I'm just looking to get into the trash room. I think I might have accidentally thrown my phone away. And I just want to have a look in the trash to see if I can find it. Now, this manager knew he was not allowed to let anybody who lived in the apartment complex go into that trash room on their own. It was a dangerous space. And so the manager was supposed to go in there with them if they needed to go in and look around in the trash. But right when Roger went up to the manager's office, the manager was waiting for a very important phone call and so couldn't really leave his office. But the manager kind of empathized with Roger and felt bad for him and said, okay, you know what? I'll just give you the key. You can go in there on your own and go looking for your cell phone. I hope you find it. And when you're done, just bring the key back here. And so Roger said, thank you very much. He took the key, he left the office, and he made his way down the hall to the trash room. And when he got there, he unlocked the lock and went inside. A few hours later, Roger's wife came home from work, and when she got to the apartment, Roger wasn't in there. She tried calling his cell phone, but he didn't pick up. And so she walked around the apartment hoping there would be some indication of where he might have gone, like a letter or something, but there was nothing. And so Roger's wife was really concerned about this because this was totally out of character for her husband to go out at night on his own. And so she, operating on a gut instinct, called the police and reported him missing. And so a few minutes later, 2 police officers show up at this apartment building. They go up to Roger's apartment, they speak to Roger's wife, and then they go into the hall and they knock on some doors of other neighbors in the area. And after speaking with them, one of the neighbors who had seen Roger earlier said, hey, he lost his phone, and the last I spoke to him, he was going to go down to the trash room to try to see if he could find his phone down there. And so the officers go down to the first floor, they go to the trash room, and they try the door, and it's unlocked. And when they open up the door and they look inside, right in the middle of this totally nondescript windowless room that basically looked like a basement, was this huge green dumpster. And above the green dumpster, high up on the ceiling, was this round opening. and that was the bottom of the trash chute. So when people like Roger and the other people who lived in this apartment building dropped their trash down their respective trash chute on each floor, the trash would come tumbling down and literally fall out of the ceiling into the dumpster. Now, this dumpster was unique. It was not like other dumpsters where the top was just wide open and anyone could lob a bag of trash in. No, this dumpster, only the left side of the dumpster had an opening for trash. The rest of the dumpster was completely welded shut. There was no way into it. And so on the left side, where this dumpster opened up to allow trash to come in, it was positioned right underneath that opening in the ceiling where the trash came tumbling down. And it wasn't just an opening. It was like this near vertical tunnel that was welded on to the top of this dumpster. And it went straight up and it had this big open mouth at the top, almost like a funnel. And it was there to catch the trash as it fell down, and it would go down this tunnel down into the dumpster. And so the gap between the ceiling and the top of this near vertical tunnel, this chute, was maybe 3 or 4 feet. And so when these officers looked into this room and they saw this dumpster and the chute and this hole in the ceiling, they also saw a ladder had been propped up on the left side of the dumpster right up against that near vertical tunnel, as if someone was trying to look down into the dumpster itself. And so one of the officers walked over, they climbed up the ladder, and when they looked down into this tunnel, down into the dumpster, they found Roger. After a lengthy investigation, this is what is believed to have happened to him. After Roger got that key from the manager, he went to the trash room, he opened it up, and then he went inside and found this huge dumpster. And he would have quickly realized the only way to look into the dumpster, and so to go looking for his phone, was to look down into this tunnel. There was a ladder nearby, so he grabbed it and he propped it up against the side of the dumpster, and he climbed up on top and he looked down into the tunnel, down into the dumpster, and as he was looking, either some trash from the ceiling fell down and struck him, causing him to lose his balance, or he just slipped somehow. But either way, he lost his balance and he tumbled into the tunnel, down into the dumpster. And what Roger didn't know is as soon as that happened, he was doomed. Because this was not some ordinary dumpster. This was a trash compactor. And as soon as Roger fell down that tunnel, his body triggered an electronic sensor that activated the trash compactor. And so the way this worked is there was this big metal ram inside the dumpster. There's a ram on one side, and once it gets activated, it will press. There's a hydraulic press that pushes it all the way to the other side. So any of the trash in this dumpster will get compressed against the other side of the dumpster. And then at that point, the ram comes all the way back. And so every time trash would come down that chute, it would trigger that sensor, the trash compactor would start, it would flatten the trash, and so on and so forth. And so Roger has fallen down into the dumpster, he's triggered this compactor, but he's legally blind, he's probably dazed from the fall, and so by the time he realizes what's going on and he's kind of looking around, there is a hydraulic press bearing down on him. And so he probably tried to jump up the tunnel to try to escape the dumpster, but there was no ladder inside this tunnel and it was nearly vertical, so there was no way to climb up and out of it. And inside of the dumpster itself, there was no emergency shutoff switch and there was no emergency exit. And so at some point, it's assumed that Roger realized he was not going to be able to climb up the tunnel. And so he only had one direction he could go, which was to retreat to the far side of the dumpster, as far away from the press as he possibly could be. But once he got over there, there was nowhere for him to go. And so he was forced to just wait as this hydraulic press slowly moved across until it finally reached him and crushed him. Now, we don't know if that very first hydraulic press actually killed Roger. All we know is Roger was trapped inside of this dumpster for several hours, and over that period of time, more and more trash was dropped down the chute, activating the press over and over and over again. And so by the time the police actually looked down into the dumpster, they saw a part of Roger's body, and immediately they could tell there was nothing they could do. Roger was definitely deceased. Roger's wife would sue the manager of the apartment building as well as the company that owned the apartment building for their negligence, but the outcomes of that case have not been made public. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comment section what it is and where you found it.
Shadow stayed a second more, then disappeared across the floor. I heard your steps fade down the hall like they were never there at all. No goodbye, no final line, just silence cutting through the time. And but nothing came, not even a mistake. No last words, no warning sign, you just left me midline like a song that never ends. No goodbye, no reason why, just your whispers echo, a haunting sound. Layers of vocals floating in the air, lost in the moment without a care. Melodic waves of emotion, experimental slip with devotion, classic crossover of styles untold. In this indie rock world we won't grow old.
it, so give us the timestamp, and if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comments section. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, the next time the like button has a big public speech they have to give, offer them a mint right beforehand. Except this mint is actually a plaque disclosing tablet. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 2 or 3 video uploads. We are now selling merchandise like flannels and hats and mugs and sweatshirts and all sorts of stuff. If you're interested, go to shopmrballen.com. If you want to learn about upcoming deals and promotions,